former address is part of the Visiting Fellows Program, which is one of many student programs here at the Institute, which seeks to bring distinguished individuals in public life to meet with students and other members of the Harvard community. As you may recall, some past visiting fellows have been Edward Asner, Mayor Harold Washington, and most recently John Nesbitt. Well, tonight's guest has been described as a journalist, an historian, and even a political scientist, as his topic tonight suggests. But by his own description, Theodore White is a storyteller, and his story, did I lose my voice? His story, thanks, is that mosaic of images and events called history. Well, his search for history began in China, where Mr. White worked as a foreign correspondent for Time magazine during World War II, and that work gained him national exposure. And after a few years of doing that, he went to Europe and did a few years of reporting there, and later returned to the United States, where he has been reporting on American politics since the mid-1950s. From that endeavor has come The Making of the President series, which won a Pulitzer Prize, and more recently his work, America in Search of Itself. He has also written In Search of History, A Personal Adventure, and Breach of Faith, The Fall of Richard Nixon. Mr. White, a native of Boston, attended Harvard College, where he studied, appropriately enough, history. Well, after Mr. White's address, we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and immediately following the event, there will be a reception in the Institute living room in Mr. White's honor, where we hope to see all of you. So I hope you all can fit in that room. So on behalf of the Institute of Politics, I'd like to present Mr. Theodore White. Thank you,
Johnny. Obviously, tonight is going to be a waltz with nostalgia. I arrived here to look Harvard over in 1932, which is, God save the mark, 53 years ago, and came up out of the subway in Harvard Square, and they told me it was going to be rebuilt. And I am now informed that there is an escalator, is it true, that opened last week in the Harvard Square subway station? Which gives you some idea, I think, folks, of how politics work, not only here in Boston and Cambridge and New England, but work all around the world. It was a very good idea 53 years ago, and it's still a good idea, and still playing around with nostalgia. I can see here one young man whom I've known for 54 years, Dr. London of the Harvard Medical Faculty, but he's younger than I am. Like I see another old friend whom I've known for only 49 years, but that's Dr. London over there, and Dr. John King Fairbank, who, pardon me? Can you hear me? All right. And Dr. Fairbank will give me my theme for this evening, because when I was very young, I wanted to write about China and politics, and I wanted to write about Chinese warlords and the relationship of force to politics. He wrote me a memorandum turning the idea down, from which I now quote. He said I was wrong, and he got off this quote. Tutors don't do this these days, but he did in those days. He said, force forces men at times. Fear forces them more than force, but ideals still more often. So the subway system here is an ideal. And Route 128 was in Widener Library in 1913, laid out in 1913. These were ideals. And we are now at a point in American politics. I'm supposed to speak about American politics, which I shall do. Now, the one great promise, the one really revolutionary idea of American politics was to knock off King George and the tyranny. And George Washington took command of the troops over here. and that the people should have the right to choose and remove their leaders, and this is still a marvelous ideal, and I believe in it. But sometimes you can push an ideal or an idea too far. You can push it to the point of absurdity, and you can interpret it to the point where it reaches the brink of obsolescence and decays and dies. So I am going to speak, you can tell by the title of these remarks I've made, is the American presidential system obsolete? Of course my answer is going to be yes, it is. Is it to be discarded? Absolutely not. But I think I'll take it through my time in American politics. Because my time in American politics, and that's 30 years, has coincided with two things. The abscessing of an idea and the advent of television. And the impact of television on the choosing of an American presidential candidate has been disastrous. All technologies shape politics. Perhaps the greatest inventor of the Southwest Belt, and Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, was Mr. Carrier, who invented Carrier air conditioning. Without the Carrier air conditioning system, you wouldn't have Dallas, Houston, San Diego, Orlando, or the others. But technology did that. Henry Ford's technology changed our country. So did the railroads. So did the high-speed printing presses for magazines. Technologies shape and change the environment in which we array our forces and display them. But there is no technology in all recorded history, except that of Johann Gutenberg, who must be 1453, 5 centuries ago. No technology has changed the world of politics as much as television. And I want to talk about the choosing of a president in the environment of television, and I'm going to talk specifically about how badly the great idea of the primaries has turned out. You all have gardens. Everybody at Harvard has a garden. You know, if you plant certain plants under a porch or a piazza, it will somehow reach up from under the porch and turn its way to the sun. Such plants are called heliotropic. All American politics today are videotropic. Every politician with any aspiration for statewide or national office is a videotropic plant. I can remember sitting up at the Statler Hotel here in Boston in the campaign of, what was it, 72 or 76? They run together in my mind with George Wallace, the former governor of Alabama. And he was very ill. He'd been shot. He was in a wheelchair, and he was chewing on his chicken bones with grease all over his chin. And he was just waiting up for Walter Cronkite to visit, because Walter Cronkite had promised to visit. And George Wallace was a very sick man, but he needed Walter Cronkite to notice him. Okay, so we're talking about the politics in the presence of TV. And we're talking, I want to speak fundamentally about the abscessing of our system by the primaries. Now, the primaries were a very good idea, and nobody knows who had them first. I think there's Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida all say they had the first presidential primary at the turn of the century, and I'm inclined to go with the scholars who say it was Florida. It makes no difference who had the idea first. The idea was you had to take politics, the choice of a president, out of the hands of the cigar-smoking bosses or the courthouse politicians, and let the people have a voice in the selection of a candidate. And then we all found, all of us who study history know, that the same people controlled elections, the same bosses who controlled elections could control primaries. So the primaries meant absolutely nothing until the year 1952 or 56. When there happened in the USA the explosion of television. in that decade between 50 and 60, there were some days where people were buying in the USA 10,000 television sets every single day. And so between 1950 and 1960, the primary process came under the scrutiny of television. And if there's anything that's fun, gentlemen and ladies, it's covering a primary, of being there and watching them cut and slash and walk around the streets. And I just want to describe it, since I'm an old veteran. You know I'm going to come out against the primary system, or for revising it very soon, but thought I should tell you how it changed. I've been overseas for many years, and I came back in 1954, just about the time television and the primaries were coming together, making their horrible marriage. And the first of these things I saw was in 1956 in New Hampshire, with Eisenhower running against Zip, who was then president, and Adlai Stevenson was running against Estes Kefauver on the Democratic side. And what little there was of a Democratic machine in New Hampshire belonged to Stevenson. So Stevenson didn't bother to come. And Estes was there, and he was making friends with us newspaper men. Of us newspaper men, we had 6 pencil reporters. There was an AP man, a UP man, 2 from New Hampshire, the Monitor and the Union Leader, 1 from the Boston Globe, 1 magazine man, and the New York Times decided the primary was important by sending in 1 man for 1 weekend, John Fenton of the Boston Bureau, to cover the New Hampshire primary. And it was a lovely thing, and Estes Kefauver swept the primary. And he really explained to the New Hampshire people what the idea was, is don't let the bosses tell you how to vote. Don't let the Cook County bosses put over Adlai Stevenson from Chicago, Illinois on the people of New Hampshire, and he won. He swept. He went on to Minnesota the next week, and the bosses there were Hubert Humphrey and Orville Freeman, and he proclaimed that the people of Minnesota must knock off Orville Freeman and Hubert Humphrey and their boss-chosen candidate, Adlai Stevenson. And I remember sitting in a room with Kefauver, who couldn't believe it was all happening, with only 1 radio in the bedroom. He was sitting on the one bed, and I was following him like a leech. And there was a bottle of whiskey between us, and we were drinking the whiskey. And as the radio reports came in, we said, gee whiz, it looked awfully good. And Esther said, and when I get like the Chetty, he said, and you ring the front bell of the White House, he said, I'm going to come down myself and let you in. But he reckoned without Adlai, who was a very tough and doughty warrior. In 1952, the total television expenditure of the Democratic Party was $80,000, because Adlai didn't feel that he should be sold as a presidential candidate like a bar of soap. He would not be sold in commercials like soap. At this point, I think somehow there's one of those silent hinges, and I see Mr. Neustadt, the great historian here. Every historian has his own hinge. But at this point, one of those silent hinges turned when Adlai decided he could not win the nomination without television. And he went off to Oregon, and he kissed the babies in the supermarkets for the cameras. And he went on down to Florida, and he kissed the babies at the supermarkets down there. And he did all those things that we now take as normal in the presidential campaign, but he knew if he were going to get that nomination, he had to do it by television. And he knocked off Oregon, knocked off Florida, and at that point, California came in. California had not yet been recognized as what I would call a capital export state that pumps money into politics rather than taking it out. New York and Texas, Illinois were the 3 great states that pumped money into politics. Adlai discovered that he could pump money out of California, too. And with that, Adlai went on to the nomination of 1956 and thereafter to disaster. But ever since then, no campaign in America has been run without total awareness. It's like a sea creature deep in the sea. You are living in the environment of television, and television is the campaign. I'll skip from the 1960 campaign with Esther Skifather, where you could sit in that's the 1956 campaign. Let me skip 24 years, otherwise I could do the Bayer Tapestries, which is the first document in history. A really good documentary, too. Let me skip now to 24 years to 1980, which is the last New Hampshire primary I covered. In 1980 in New Hampshire, there were no longer 7 reporters covering the primary. There were between 1,500 and 2,000 of us. We were all called media personnel, and we didn't report the event. We smothered it. We just started. Instead of John Fenton, for one weekend, the New York Times had 6 correspondents in and out. By that time, exit polling was developing, and I was an advisor to NBC. And we could sit in a booth in Manchester, New Hampshire, and press the computer buttons from which the reports would come back from Camden, New Jersey, telling us what was happening on the west side of Manchester, New Hampshire, telling us what was happening in Nashua, telling us what was happening in the Merrimack Valley. It was all computerized. And as I say, it was smothered. The Harvard Crimson sent up a platoon of about 6 reporters, and the Columbia School of Journalism outdid them. They set up the whole blessed Columbia School of Journalism. So you had student reporters reporting student reporters. It was a media event. You had the BBC and the French Radio Diffusion. You had Nordwest Deutsche Rundfunk and the Japanese nets and everything else. And so by 1984, partly because my legs are getting tired, and partly because I'm getting bored, I no longer covered the campaign. Or I no longer covered the primaries. Primaries are now designed by technicians, by campaign managers. They spread the states out before them. They pick the scenery for you somewhere down there. At the heart of a rally, there is a pinpoint head in the cone of light. And if you're looking for the Italian vote in the Bronx, you go to that great Italian supermarket in the Bronx, and you're seen shaking hands with people and trying to talk a bit of Italian. If you want to get the student vote, people pick out a campus with the prettiest co-eds, and you're there talking with pretty co-eds, and you're there also at an old age home. The whole thing is designed for you. You go to Charlotte Street in the Bronx. The thing is designed as a panorama done by technicians, done by slices, by demographic slices, and all designed for television. Now, what has happened really is that what began as a good idea in the 1900s and lay submerged until 1952, the Republicans were the first to rediscover the primaries in 52, has been resurrected and become a monster. There's nobody here, I don't think, even at the Institute of Politics, who can keep in mind all the rules that govern the primary elections of the USA. In New York, we've changed the nominating rules 4 times in 4 successive presidential elections. When I first went to California, there was one name on top of the ballot, and that one name was winner take all. This year, no candidate had his name on the ballot. In Texas, you have to vote twice on Sunday, once in the morning and once in the evening at a caucus. In South Carolina, a Democrat or a Republican can vote in either primary. In New Jersey, different rules. And Governor Winter, I don't know how you do it in Mississippi, but the rules are different in every state, and they change every 4 years, and no teacher can tell his kids or order a textbook that will tell you how Massachusetts is going to choose its delegates in 1988, or how New York will choose its delegates. The trouble with this system right now is that it won't work under television, because television is looking for drama, not issues or candidates. This system divides the United States. If you start off in New Hampshire, you got to be aware of the National Rifle Association and the French-Canadian vote. As soon as you button down the French-Canadian vote, you can forget about the French-Canadians. They don't vote anywhere else. In Massachusetts, you got to worry about the Greek vote if you're going up to Lowell or Lawrence, and you got to be in favor of Cyprus, whatever the Greek side of Cyprus is. You have to be fair. You then go on to New York, and downstate New York, you got to be aware of the fact you got to cultivate the Jews, the blacks, the Italians. You no longer bother about the Irish. I'm sorry, they've amalgamated. Upstate in Buffalo, you stress the plight of the steel industry. Downstate in New York, in New York City, you stress the plight of the garment industry, and you go on across the country this way, dividing and splintering the USA as you go. The present primary system brings to the nomination a president who can't govern. And if anybody asks me later, I'll say what I think should be done about it. I just want to go through the narrative of this first. Walter Mondale said of the 1984 election that television defeated him. It wasn't television that licked Walter Mondale. It was the primary system. He courted so many special interests and committed himself to so many special interests that that lovely, sharp figure whom we all knew from years past became a blur and a buzz, and nobody knew who the hell Walter Mondale was. It was the primary, and the way television distorted the primary that ruined him. He did have some great moments on TV. He was not licked by TV. He, you can say only that he was where Roosevelt was gathering together a party which could lead a coalition. The Democratic Convention was a coalition in search of a party. It had been so splintered and fragmented, it could neither win the election nor govern the USA. And what Mondale proved was simply that he proved a new rule of political arithmetic. If you add up all the groups of Democratic heritage, the workers and the farmers and the Jews and the blacks and the Irish and the blue collars, he made a new rule of political arithmetic, that the sum is less than the total of its parts. Which brings me, I hope, yes, soon, I'm watching the clock, to one of the stories that Sam Irvin used to tell of the old fella down at the county courthouse down south, sitting around, and suddenly one of their cronies is gone, and they send out a search party to find their crony. And he comes back and he says, "Hey, fellas," he says, "I tell you," he says, I found him, he said. His head was on one side of the tracks, and his body was on the other side of the tracks, and something very serious must have happened. Now, in 1984, something very serious did happen. This will be by 1988, 30-odd plus years, where the Republicans have held the executive head of government, 30-odd years in which for 24 the Republicans have held the executive office, and 12 in which the Democrats held the office. The executive of the USA has been cut off from the legislative body. The head has been severed from the body. The party system has been all but destroyed. It's been destroyed, I think, by the coming together of two things, of television and the reforms and the ideals and the attempt to liberalize, the attempt to open up the system. We've opened up the system so that it's now anarchic. I haven't talked about the other grotesqueries in the system, but it is grotesque. Not only the business of having to cover 36 primaries in 1 year, which bores the American people. Not only the pollution of the system by money. I've been a trustee of the Citizens Research Foundation, and 25 years ago we thought the only solution was to get the money out in the open. And we got those laws passed by Congress. The money's out in the open right now. It's drooling in the open. No politician should be stupid enough to be cut by graft. You have the Friends of Mario Cuomo. We raised $2,400,000. You have the Friends of everybody. You give money in the open right now, and money and the PACs are a pollution of the process. The conventions have been distorted out of all meaning. There are so many other things mechanically wrong. The process creaks and groans. It does not give any of you young people a fair shot at making a reasonable decision on whom you want as your candidate. And if it was bad in 1984, it's going to be worse in 1988 when both parties have primaries. If you think the Republicans aren't mean to each other, you're wrong. They could be just as mean as Democrats. I still think of the 1980 campaign with George Bush won by 60% in Pennsylvania, and somehow Ronald Reagan came out with the majority of the votes. I don't think that the parties, the political parties of the USA, can reform themselves any more than generals can win wars. It needs a superior review of the entire presidential election system so that all these doodads and gimcracks could be put together. I think that the only authority that can put together a reasonable choice of all the people is the Congress of the USA. These are politician emeriti. They're in office. And most of the guys in Congress are rather decent people and are themselves shamed by the way the money process, the TV process, the primary process deprives them of the leadership they need. There are an awful lot of things to be done in this changing country of ours. We're going through a demographic upheaval, an immigration upheaval. We're going through such inputs from such universities as these, of biotechnologies, of life itself, of Star Wars. This system, the way it is handled right now, cannot really produce, I think, a great president, or will not be able to do so 10 years from now. I think perhaps the first agenda, this is the 99th Congress since the Constitution of the USA. I would like to see before the 100th Congress convenes that we get some rules that make reasonable the system of choosing men to run for the presidency. And I will be, I think on time, I think it's just exactly 30 minutes, and I will be very glad and even more pleased to answer questions.
As Mr. White said, he'd be pleased to answer questions. We have microphones set up along the balcony there at either end and then down here. I would ask you to come to the microphone if you'd like to ask a question for two reasons. One, so that we can hear you, and two, because this forum event is being recorded for broadcast on radio later on in the year. So I guess we'll begin with the gentleman up here.
Okay, Mr. White, I'll take you up on it.
Oh, who's that?
He's coming from up there.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. White, I'll take you up on it. How should we nominate and elect a president, in your view, other than the way we're doing it now?
All right, there are at least 7 or 8 cliche ideas, and I won't give you a new one. I'll give you the cliche I favor most. I believe the idea of a primary is a good one. I believe the idea of 37 primaries at once is crazy. I would, if I had my way, slice the USA up by time zones. I'm devotedly against regional primaries or dated primaries. I would slice it up by time zones. Everybody in the Eastern time zone would vote in his state's primary on the first Tuesday of March. That eliminates New Hampshire, alas, but I'm willing to lose it. But I'm willing to lose it in order to have New Hampshire and Massachusetts and New York and Virginia and South Carolina vote on the same day. That gives you a cross-section. You can't go into New Hampshire and hunt for the French-Canadian vote, or go to Pennsylvania and hunt for the Steele vote, and go down to Florida and either be pro-racist or anti-racist. It gives you a horizontal cross-section. First primary. A second slice would be the Midwestern time zone. And that would give you Michigan, I think, and that would give you Illinois, Iowa, right down to most of Tennessee, to Alabama and Georgia. So again, you would have rural and industrial people voting at the same time. There's a wonderful narrative quality to the primaries. You learn how a guy stands up under pressure, whether he breaks down or cries. You see what his physical stamina is. You would go on to the Pacific time zone and then the Western time zone. We'd have 4 cross-sectional slices spread over 4 months, which would be a marvelous educative process. We'd have 4 months to think about it. And each of the states would maintain their sovereign independence and produce the delegates they want, but the candidates would not have to pander to every group, every special interest, every labor union. The candidates would have to speak as national candidates on national issues, which is what the exercise is all about. That's my swift 60-second solution. I can go on.
How about one national primary in one day? What would you think?
Terrible. Terrible. It's like a semifinal. You need almost as much money for one national primary on the same day as you would need for the presidential election itself. Who would finance it? Would turn the entire campaign really over to the TV designers and the ADIs and all those people. I love the narrative quality about a primary, of how a candidate can emerge slowly from March to June. You emerge in March in the first round, you wind up in California in June, and I believe the best form of instruction is storytelling. The primaries make a story right now. It's one day for one national primary would be cataclysmic. It would pull the American system apart.
I think we have another question here.
Yes, Mr. White.
Yes, sir.
I'm originally from the state of Kansas, which traditionally will elect Democratic governors, but Republican senators. In the presidential race, how do you explain that voters will choose one party for some of their offices, but will shop around for another party for their other candidates?
You know, Kansas has always been a perplexity to me ever since I learned about it here as an undergraduate 50 years ago, and it was called Bleeding Kansas. William Allen White I don't understand Kansas politics. It's a state that raises grain, settled by New Englanders, and probably a very nice state. All I've ever seen of it is going around with candidates and seeing rallies. You do have Republican senators usually. You don't always have Democratic governors. Recently, you've been having more of them. I guess the only honest answer I can give you is I'm going to let you explain Kansas. I can't.
I have a question here, gentleman Murray.
Yeah, Mr. White.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask you. You've pretty thoroughly denounced the role of television in politics. I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about the positive side, if you think there is one. I mean, isn't it true that television has, if nothing else, brought politics into every household and gotten more people involved in the political process? And you talked about how the campaigns lack issues, but even the partial issues the television reports are getting to more people than they otherwise would have, which it seems to me is making the whole system more accountable to the American public than it would otherwise be. So I want to ask you to comment on that, and I also want to ask you if you obviously think that the media plays a negative role now. Do you think that it could play a positive role in some way, and what would that be?
You're asking me for moral and conscientious judgments on a natural phenomena. I can no more praise or denounce the sun up above than I can praise or denounce television. It is the ambiance of our political system. It can parch, it can burn out the candidates, or it can make them flourish. I think television's finest moment happened to be the assassination of John F. Kennedy, in which a nation that was really shocked by an act of violence was pulled together into a community by beautiful television broadcasting. I think you get the high point of Walter Cronkite's arranging the thing between Sadat and Golda Meir. No, it was Begin. And I think that was only television could have done that swiftly. Oh, sure. I think television in general, net, has been good and useful to the American political system. But television, like everything else, abuses its power. And there have been many episodes of power abuse. If I were going to write the new rules for a campaign, I would perhaps forbid any political candidate from buying any time on television. The airwaves of this country are like the highways. The air belongs to everybody. Television station has a license to use a certain wave band. And I don't see why they should make money on using the public air. I would give each of the two candidates 100 minutes of free airtime starting on Labor Day and let them pluck their 100 minutes off from whatever shows they want, whether it's the Olympics or whatever. And say that's what you, television, have to give to the political process. And I would forbid any political advertising after Labor Day. Television has done an awful lot. It's done better overseas and it's done at home. Because the iron rule of television is make the show march. It's got to be interesting. I've been advisor to several television networks, and if they had followed my advice, they would have gone broke. I would like them to devote more time to issues. But they know the people out there want to see the horse race. We'd rather know why Gary Hart changed his name than know what Gary's new ideas were. So a drama is the first need of television, and they'll do anything to cramp the political races into a dramatic form. I know I've answered only one of your questions, but I think I've answered it at greater length than you expected. I'm for television with restraints, like a spirited horse that you keep in harness.
You have a question up here in the balcony.
Yes, Mr. White, you spoke about candidates and their pandering to various special interest groups, and I wonder if television doesn't make that a little bit more difficult, because every night when you see the candidates on the news, everyone across the country sees them. It seems to make it a little more difficult for a candidate to present a different message at every stop along the way, as it might have been in the past.
Well, if Jonathan here had a fund, I would send you, Jonathan Moore, our director, I would send you out in the campaign to see the way the campaign works. What they fight for, the crown piece of public opinion right now, is the half-hour evening news, whether it's ABC, NBC, or CBS. That's where the campaign really goes on. That's national. That's where they speak to national interests. I don't know who does the half-hour newscasts here in Boston, or who does the half-hour. I know in New York. I know in Connecticut. A candidate who's moving around will shoot one speech in the morning, preferably before noon, on a national issue, freeze the bomb, or something like that. But then he will do 6 or 7 more interviews with local TV stations. He will go up to Buffalo, and there'll be 3 TV stations in Buffalo, and he'll speak local issues, which will run from protection of the steel industry to free the captive states of Eastern Europe, and then come down to another area of New York and speak to farm issues. What you see on a national television in the evening is about maybe 2% or 5% of the exposure he's got that day. And that day he will go and look, you know darn well if you're going to the Italian market in Philadelphia or the Italian market in Upper Bronx, you aren't going to be on national TV. But you're going to be on local TV. You're going to be in the 5:30 news, the 6 o'clock news, 6:30 news, and you say, thank God they won't see me out in Ohio with this. TV doesn't make it more difficult for a candidate to reach the national audience, to reach the special audience. TV, and particularly with cable coming in, makes it possible for him to buy some cable time in New York City, where the Chinese population is multiplying at a phenomenal rate, and take time on the Chinese channel at night and make a special pitch to the Chinese vote in New York City, which is very, very important. We still haven't gotten as many Afghans in New York to reach for the Afghan vote, but they'll be coming. Look, I think there are 3 great issues. I'll come back to your question. Going before the American people right now. We are undergoing a change of population and of leadership such as we haven't known since the first decade of this century, since 1910. There's got to be an Immigration Act. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody will talk about it. It should happen. Must happen. It's easier to talk about it if we have regional primaries than if a candidate is worried about the Hispanic vote in New Mexico, Texas, and California. That's an issue. There's the War and Peace issue. I think in order to get at those issues, we need a congressional revision and congressional takeover of the laws governing national choice of candidates. I think I did answer your question.
Great. We have a gentleman who's been waiting up here.
Yes, good evening, Mr. White. For a number of years, you worked in NBC News alongside John Chancellor. And I remember in 1980, Mr. Chancellor announced that Ronald Reagan had won the presidency at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and it was only 8:30 p.m. Western Time. I would like to know what you think of exit polling and its effect of early projections on the Western vote. And my second...
I really wish you hadn't asked the question.
And my second question involves your opinion of internal reforms within the Democratic Party. Since 1972, the Democratic Party has opened up internal party affairs and toward minorities, toward affirmative action steps, and equal representation among men and women. In 1982, with the Hunt Commission, there was some pull away from that in allocating some seats toward the party pros in the conventions. What trend would you like to see in the system?
Well, you know, one should never speak before a student audience. They ask all the wrong questions, or they ask all the questions that have no answers. Let me tell you about 1980. And put the question to you. At about 5:30 that afternoon, before going to the studio, I called Pat Cadell, who was President Carter's chief pollster. And I said, "How's it going, Pat?" And he said, "We're down 10 points. We've lost it." That's 5:30 in the afternoon. I then got a call from Dick Worthland, who was Reagan's chief pollster, and he said, "This is great. We're going to be 11 points up. We've even got a chance of carrying Massachusetts." And so I went over to the studio and I said, "Hey, fellas, you know what I know? I got the White House, I got the Reagan stuff." And they said, "All our exit polling shows the same thing." And I said, "Well, I'm supposed to kick off in the first half hour. And since I know, you know, White House knows, Worthland knows, that this is a disaster for Cadell, what am I going to say? I can't announce, you know, you're there on a mic for 2 minutes. I can't fake it." So we all get together in a huddle, and we decide, you have to do this. It's horrible. You have to decide that you use blab words. Something like, I think I said, "It's too early yet to tell," knowing I was lying, "how the election is going. But every early indication is that this may be a turning point in American political history. It may be the end of an era, but we have to wait and see how the results actually come out." Well, that was fake. I don't know whether I was lying or not. But what do you say when you're in that position? So John went on at 8:10, I think, 8:10, 8:12. Polls were still open in California. Sure, I think it influences an election. I don't know what do you want us to do? You get the breakdown of the vote state by state. If you paste them up on the board there, anybody with a hand calculator can add it up, and you know an electoral majority is one, while before California or Nevada or Pacific Coast, they're still coming home from work out there. Insoluble problem. That's one of those things that Congress has got to take care of. I think you ought to have the polls open across the country from, say, 7 in the morning Eastern time to 7 in the evening Eastern time, and that would mean 10 a.m. California to 10 p.m. California. You ought to have simultaneous voting, but some of the constitutional lawyers here will tell you whether that's feasible or not. Then you ask me about affirmative action, and again I would turn the question to you. I don't know what you mean by affirmative action, nor does anybody else. Affirmative action means a quota system. I'm against it. The affirmative actions of the Democratic Party, you should go see. You should, please, Jonathan, send some of your young people down to see the Democratic Rules Committee meet someday. And that's where it smells like a sausage factory. That's where they stuff the rancid grease and the peppers and the popcorn and everything else into the sausages. And you don't know till 2 years later that this sausage is going to poison you or explode on you. My most unfavorite word is outreach. There are certain stipulated groups that you have to outreach for. At this last Rules Committee, and that's really where the Democratic Party structures itself, there came up the proposition under the heading of Affirmative Action to entitle gays and lesbians, a gay and lesbian caucus, as an official caucus of the Democratic Party. And it's a room not much bigger than this, and everybody rushed down to the microphone. Stand in line to get to the microphone and make your speech. And, you know, you expect to hear some southern voices of the Democratic National Committee, Rules Committee. Wasn't a single southerner speaking. There were some obviously striking people in the group demanding equal rights for gays and lesbians as an official caucus, which means they have to be represented on the Finance Committee, the Executive Committee, and every other committee in official capacities as gays or lesbians. It occurred to me, well, why not a caucus of the handicapped? Why not have the handicapped officially represented? Why not have left-handed people officially represented? Because, you know, getting on a bus if you're left-handed is difficult. The official caucuses do consist of, there's a black caucus, a Hispanic caucus, a farm caucus, a women's caucus. I'm in favor of those. Then when you push it on to a liberal progressive caucus, which is officially seated on the executive committee, you push it on to a gay and lesbian caucus, and then maybe we ought to have an Asian American caucus. You are pushing this idea of splitting and dividing the Democratic Party to a point where it's absurd. There was one man who raised his voice against the proposition. Sounded like a Boston voice. Actually, it was, an Irish American from Chicago. And he said, look, he says, when you talk about this, he says, think about Illinois. One half of our vote in Illinois is from the Bible Belt, and the other half are devout Catholics. They aren't going to buy, either one aren't going to buy a gay and lesbian caucus. And he was booed down. Absolutely booed down. He said, next thing you know, you're going to be legislating to legitimize sodomy. And he was booed out of the hall. Now, that's the Democratic Rules Committee. And I really, you have to take my word for it, I have no feeling about gays or lesbians, except that they do have the right to live in their own lifestyle. Just as anybody has the right to live in his own lifestyle in this country. But you do not give a legitimate leverage or grip on the political process to people of different lifestyles. I can see how you would do it for blacks and for women and for farmers, but not for people of that tendency. So you ask me about affirmative action. I would violently oppose anybody who would penalize a gay or a lesbian for his lifestyle. I'd oppose that legislatively and in public. I would not give him or her any special privilege. And as you push special privileges along, oh God, I was on the Board of Overseers at Harvard. And we had, they picked on Harvard because I think we're the most liberal university in the whole United States of America. They picked on us because we weren't appointing enough women professors. This is the Civil Rights Commission. And they wanted us to appoint women professors to a degree of equality. We sat down, we figured out that if we appointed women professors to a degree of equality, that for the next 27 years, we would never appoint a white male professor again. And 27 years is a long time to wait for a young history professor who happens, unfortunately, to be a white male. You can push affirmative action over the cliff to absurdity. I think it was a good idea. It's been made into a system of regulatory rules right now which cramp the entire administrative process. And I think I'll drop that question there.
We have a question to the left here.
Mr. White, from time to time you hear the generalization that a 4-year term for the presidency leaves less time for policymaking and more time for campaigning and having to go out and get the votes. What's your feeling on a 4-year term of presidency versus perhaps the proposed 6-year? Will that give more room for concrete policymaking?
I like the 4-year term for the presidency. Actually, I'd be for 3 4-year terms. I didn't think that Roosevelt did very badly in his 3rd, 4th-year term. I think some of Eisenhower's ablest and best decisions were taken in his 2nd 4-year term. It's good that every 4 years a president has to go before the people and seek reconfirmation. So, the answer to your question is, I don't want a one-shot 6-year president. I want 2 shots at him. That may not sound like political science. It's just a mixture of experience and memory.
Over here to the right here.
Mr. White, you've been talking a lot about the sellers of politics, the purveyors, the television people, and the media. Would you please comment a little bit on the buyers out there, the electorate, and why the current state of American politics is such that we're sort of tuning people off? One has to assume that the people selling TV and everything else believe there's a market out there that is buying all this, or they wouldn't continue to sell it, although that's not necessarily, that doesn't follow one from the other. And secondly, I'm not sure I understand why you suggest that it's Congress who would most properly address the issue when most congressmen have barely won their first election, when they're busy worrying about the next 2 years, and how the kinds of problems you see existing today would be solved in a situation where people are worrying about winning tomorrow, not how to solve things down the line.
Let's see. The buyers of television. The television people tune in. The television audience tunes in for drama. They want the horse race. There's Iowa, which isn't really good drama. That's caucuses, and you send a couple of camera crews around Des Moines or Rock Island. New Hampshire's real drama. Everybody can find that Yankee skinflint who will say whatever they want. He can find the Dartmouth College student. He can find you've got to really, and of course, New Hampshire's really a good free-for-all. It's a wonderful chunk of drama. And so television goes on through what are now called Super Tuesdays. It goes on, and then by the time it gets to, I think, about May, people get bored. And the audience, the buyers, tune out. They don't tune in again till June 5th, when California winds up the season. What's television? Television is cut the way all of us are. We are trying, in our conscience, to give information, a bit of history, a few useful facts, and entertain them at the same time. I write my books that way. I hope if I put enough entertainment in, I can give them enough useful information to carry them through the dull passages. And there are dull passages. Any magazine or newspaper knows that if you're dull, you die. So the buyers of television like to see those primaries in the first 2 months. And of course, they love to see the conventions. Whether they... I think they're better informed than they used to be. I really do. On balance, over the past 30 years, I think people have a clearer idea of who their candidates or what their issues are. And now, like Ronald Reagan, I've got to say, I forgot what your second question was, ma'am.
I asked you why you felt that Congress was the proper body to address the kinds of problems you've been discussing.
Oh, because if I were going to try to reform the drug trade in the USA, I'd gather together a lot of convicted drug dealers and say, how do you stop it? It's because, look, no man is a great No man is a great statesman unless he's a good politician. These guys know how it is out there. And Congress has patched and patched and patched till the electoral system looks like a gypsy quilt. Congress abolished the poll tax down south. Now, I believe constitutionally they had no right to abolish the poll tax down south, but it was a congressional act. Congress did it. Congress put through the rule that now finances presidential campaigns. Congress puts through the appropriation that picks up the deficit at the Democratic and the Republican National Convention. They're paying for it with our dollars, and they know one hell of a lot about the problems of the USA and about the, no, I was going to tell a dirty joke. I shouldn't. About what smells under the skirts in American politics. And I don't know a single guy on the Rules Committee of either Democrats or Republicans who doesn't believe that the political parties themselves cannot reform themselves and that Congress has to do the job. If I were Reagan, as my crowning act, I would send in a set of bills to reform the presidential process.
We've got room for two more questions.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. White, I want to ask you a question about the candidates. Do you think our present American political system produces the best candidates? And if not, where do you think, what can our process do to amend itself for people, the best people for, say, the presidency to rise and go for the presidency?
That's what we've been talking about this evening. How do you get the best? And although my history professor here taught me history in a Chinese context, I believe that there are unpredictable things that happen in history. It does go in cycles. I prefer the biblical metaphor of the 7 lean years and the 7 fat years, and I think from 1932 with Franklin D. Roosevelt, followed by Harry Truman, followed by Dwight D. Eisenhower, followed by John F. Kennedy, we had 30 years of the best national leadership of any democracy in the world. That's a superb train of leaders, and their actions both at home and abroad, monuments to American vision. Since then, alas, we have had